Welcome to the OK Let's Learn podcast. This is two podcasts in one where we dive into tons of family-friendly books and stories, and another where we just dive into tons of interesting topics and people. My name is Kevin O'Keefe. So today, let's learn all about Paolo Toscanelli. Paolo who? Yeah, you know what? It's really not about him, but it's about his map. How about learning what the world's map was in 1491? What do we think the world looked like? Well, there was one man who had a really good guess. And guess who he influenced? Yes, Christopher Columbus. It really is an amazing story, and it's so indicative of the world view here in 1491. It's such an interesting story. Now, before we begin, please go to the show notes. Please consider supporting the show over on patreon.com. And yes, you will be able to be named a producer of the show. So, let's learn all about Paolo Toscanelli's map. I mean, really, just think about it. Talk about a map that is valuable. Can you imagine if we had the original? But unfortunately, we don't. And even though we have a lot of proof, a lot of evidence, we don't know specifically. Historians are coming down on the fact that we cannot prove that, in fact, Columbus had his map with him. But there's absolutely, positively lots of evidence that he did. So this map, no doubt, helped change the course of world history. Why? Because if it wasn't for this map, who's to say when and if ultimately the Europeans would have ended up finding the new world? Now, of course, they would have, but when would they have? And under what circumstances would our world have been different? Talk about a what if. So here again, why would anybody in 1492 think it made sense to sail west from Europe in order to reach Asia? Because that's where Christopher Columbus wanted to go. My younger members of the audience, he said, you know what? To King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella of Spain, Christopher Columbus said, hey, I can get all the spices and silk and gold and silver you want, King and Queen. Just let me go. I know that I can reach Asia so much quicker because I'm going to sail west. And where did he get that information from? Paolo Toscanelli. Now, before we talk about his map, we need to get rid of one of the most famous myths in history. The story many of us learned when we were growing up was something like this. In the 1400s, people thought the world was flat. Sailors were afraid that if they traveled too far, they would fall off the edge. Christopher Columbus was one of the courageous few that no. He said the world wasn't flat, it was round, and his voyage finally proved it. That's a great story, right? Well, guess what? It's wrong, or at least it's mostly wrong. The idea of our Earth being a sphere went back to the ancient Greeks. By the 4th century BC, Aristotle presented evidence for our Earth being round. He noticed, among other things, that during a lunar eclipse, the Earth's shadow on the moon was curved. Then around the 3rd century BC, this Greek scholar, his name was Eratosthenes. He went even further. He figured out and came really close. He figured out the circumference of the Earth, the distance around the Earth, by comparing the angle of the sun's rays at two different locations in Egypt. So, bottom line, 1,700 years before Columbus sailed, scholars already had a pretty good idea. The Earth was a sphere and approximately how large it was. That knowledge just didn't simply disappear. But throughout the Middle Ages, the idea about the Earth being round remained the standard model with anyone that was educated. But again, this was not the world that we live in today. A lot of people were not educated. Now, what I'm saying here is that it wasn't about the story that, yeah, everyone figured that the world was flat. What I'm saying here is that the argument and the story is not about whether it was flat or round. It was, how big is the earth? And how much ocean lied between Europe and Asia if we sail west? People were not sailing west to get to Asia. They weren't even going around Africa at this point. Go back to my previous episode on Vasco da Gama. No, they were going overland to Asia. It was too long, it was too costly, and now with the age of exploration, so many people said, you know what? We got to find a quicker way. But here is the reality. Most experts correctly estimated that sailing west to Asia was far too long and dangerous, but Columbus mistakenly believed Asia was much closer. He spent years trying to find someone willing to finance his plan. He first approached King John II of Portugal, but Portuguese experts rejected the proposal in part because they believed Columbus had badly underestimated the distance, and Portugal was already making progress on its own route south around Africa, as I mentioned. I mean, it was only 6 years later that Vasco da Gama did reach India. So here was Columbus. He goes back to Spain, and yes, he ends up convincing Queen Isabella and King Ferdinand, whose own advisors initially had said, no, this is not going to work. But he persisted for years, and it was finally in 1492. And it was just after Spain had completed their conquest of Granada that they finally agreed. Again, it really wasn't that they 100% agreed with Columbus's estimate as to how far it would be to get to Asia, but they just figured their big rival being Portugal, they gave him 3 ships and the financial backing, not because Columbus had proved that he was right, but because the possible payoff was simply too great to ignore. So let's look at the map and what people understood back in 1491, right? Maps had been made for centuries. One of the really early influential map makers was Claudius Ptolemy. He lived in the 2nd century AD. He organized the known world using latitude and longitude. So his writings would become enormously influential during the European Renaissance. But think about the problem that these early map makers faced. Europe was known, parts of Africa was known, Asia was known through ancient writings, trade, and reports of travelers, primarily with Marco Polo. But the Europeans did not know that 2 enormous continents, obviously North and South America, stood between Europe and Asia. They also had no idea just how enormous the Pacific Ocean was. So again, you just have to figure the map at this time, no new world, and you just had to figure out the distance going west from Europe to Asia. Enter Paolo Toscanelli. He was born in Florence, Italy in 1397. So he wasn't a sea captain or anything like that. He wasn't even any explorer at all that was traveling around the world. He was a physician, a mathematician, astronomer, and a geographer. He just was fascinated by measuring things. So here's what he did. It's 1474. Notice the year. This is 18 years before Columbus ended up sailing. Toscanelli wrote to a Portuguese clergyman. His name was Fernão Martins, who had connections with the courts, the king of Portugal, who was Alfonso V at the time. He described his proposed western route, and importantly, he prepared a map to illustrate it. Unfortunately, like I said, that original map is gone to history. It's lost. We don't know where and how it disappeared. And therefore, when you see something labeled today, Toscanelli's map of 1474, and this is what the entire episode is about, you are looking really at a later reconstruction based on Toscanelli's surviving writings and other geographical information from the period. But we know enough to understand the central idea. The idea was simple. Asia was much closer to Europe than it actually is. Now, what's on Toscanelli's map? I will have a link in the podcast notes. You got to look at this map. It's so interesting. It's just basically one big ocean with over to the right, you have Portugal, and then you have the western coast of Africa. And then basically what you've got is a series of tons of little islands in the bottom left-hand corner, obviously the southwestern part of this map, and you have this big islands. And that's what he thought was Japan. To the left of that, to the furthest part of the map over on the western side, you have this big landmass which he thought was China, present-day China. Now, it's important to step back for a second because with his understanding of these areas, when you look at this map, you got this big island, then you got a series of tiny islands, then you have this big landmass. Well, he, along with most Europeans at the time, called these areas the Indies, right? It didn't mean present-day country of India. Europeans could use the term more broadly for the lands and islands of the southern and eastern part of Asia. And yes, one major destination, they didn't reference it as China back then. It was Cathay. Now that's spelled Cathay. And the big island that I mentioned, that again is just to the east of the big landmass that we again know as China, that was Japan. But back then, it was written on the map, and the Europeans referred to it as Cipango, which is spelled Cipango. The Europeans had heard of Japan largely, again, through the accounts of Marco Polo, and he described present-day Japan as this really wealthy island that had lots of gold. So this was the map Toscanelli came up with. But there was several problems with the map. He underestimated the distance involved. That was the big mistake. His sources also made Asia extend too far eastward. Different calculations of the Earth's circumference and confusion involving different units of measurement compounded the problem. But nevertheless, this is what Toscanelli proposed. So how did Columbus get his map? This is where we need to separate what we know from the traditional version of the story. According to surviving material associated with Columbus, he learned about Toscanelli's proposal and communicated with him. Toscanelli supposedly sent Columbus a copy of his 1474 letter and chart. For generations, that became part of the standard Columbus story. Toscanelli made the map. Columbus got it, and Columbus used it to plan his voyage. And yeah, there's good reason to connect the dots, right? But historians have debated exactly how directly he used the map. And because the original map is gone, we can't say, well, this is exactly it. We don't have it. We also do not possess the shipboard inventory proving that Columbus actually carried his chart with him on October 12, 1492. Having said all this, there's good evidence that he did have the chart with him, despite what I've said, and all of the ideas that he carried forth with him on that first voyage. And where originally does all this come from? Well, this witness, his name is Bartolomé de las Casas. He was a Spanish friar and historian who later had access to Columbus's papers and preserved much of what we know from his now lost original journal. Listen to this. Las Casas specifically wrote that Columbus had a chart made by Toscanelli, and he indicated that he actually later possessed that chart. We also have this remarkable piece of evidence. Toscanelli's 1474 letter describing the westward route to Asia was copied into a book that belonged to Columbus, right? Apparently in Columbus's own handwriting. So we cannot produce the lost chart today and prove that this was the exact piece of paper that he had aboard the Santa Maria, the ship that Columbus took, but it gives us good reason to believe, like I said, and the reason we're doing this podcast, that his map and ideas were part of what Columbus took with him when he sailed west. Now, you may be thinking, Kevin, what are you doing here? You're just confusing me. Did he have it or not? The point is, we can't prove it, and that is where historians come down, which is understandable, right? But this is so long ago, and there's good circumstantial evidence that he had, certainly. If he didn't have it actually on the voyage, he certainly had it in his hand, had it in his possession prior to going out there. And here's the thing. Toscanelli never ended up hearing about what Columbus ended up doing because he passed away 10 years before he actually crossed the Atlantic, right? So Columbus made 4 voyages between 1492 and 1504. And then Columbus passed away in 1506, and he died not knowing that he found a new world. He still believed that the lands he reached were connected with Asia. But by then, evidence from later voyages, especially voyages along this enormous coastline of, yes, South America that we know today, it was convincing Europeans that this could not simply be the eastern edge of Asia. Amerigo Vespucci, he became famous for arguing that these lands were a new world and a separate part of the earth previously unknown to Europeans. Then in 1507, just a year after Columbus had passed away, there was this German map maker. His name was Martin Verschmueller. He published a new world map, and he treated these western lands as separate from Asia, and he gave this new land a name, America, after Amerigo Vespucci. That 1507 map brings us full circle. Think about it. The geographical mistake that sent Columbus looking for Asia was finally being replaced by a radically different picture of the world. Toscanelli drew a map showing Columbus how to reach Asia. Columbus sailed west, believing that map would lead him there. And the voyages that followed eventually revealed, yes, that an enormous new world stood in the way. The map was wrong, but that wrong map helped change the map of the world forever. Friends, thanks for taking this journey, learning all about Paolo Toscanelli's map of 1474, what the world looked like in 1491. Reach out to me at kevmok21@gmail.com. We are on Substack. We are on YouTube. We are on Spotify. We are on Facebook. Okay, Let's Learn Facebook page. Go there. You will be able to see, in addition to the links in the show notes, you will be able to see the map that I'm referring to all during this episode. You have to check it out. And listen, again, I've mentioned this in the beginning of the podcast. Look at the link in the show notes so you can support the podcast. You can become a producer and be named on every episode going forward. That's patreon.com. And until next time, have fun and keep learning.